I know that there's a lot of conversation in the room, and I know that it's all interesting because I know a lot of people here. But we'd like to get started on our next panel, the impact of short-term rentals on long-term housing. Short-term rentals, of course, have become a mainstay of the tourism industry in many Hudson Valley towns. Recently, Airbnb, just a brand name of short-term rentals, announced that its host community in the Mid-Hudson region earned a combined $28.3 million in supplemental income while welcoming about 145,000 guests who checked into the region in the summer from Memorial Day weekend through Labor Day. Obviously, that's a significant economic component to the Hudson Valley. Critics are calling short-term rentals rogue hotels or instant hotels because, unlike hotels, short-term rentals have virtually no oversight or accountability, potentially creating a public safety issue in the communities in which they are found. And in some instances, the folks who own or occupy homes next to the short-term rentals are unhappy with the commercial activity in their neighborhood. They resent the constant strangers, noise, other nuisances associated with living next door to short-term renters who may not abide with the same common courtesies that we usually anticipate from our neighbors. Leaders in the communities say that's because homes that could be available for rent or sale to local residents are instead being bought by investors and listed on short-term platforms, company websites such as Airbnb, vacation rental by owner, Flipkey, or HomeAway, and perhaps others. Property owners or hosts enjoy extra income generated by renting out space, that spare bedroom that they're not using anyway. And in fact, countless hosts have come to count on this added income to help pay for the repairs, their mortgage, their property taxes, and other costs associated with daily living, which is exactly the initial purpose of short-term rentals. So we have some panelists here that bring a planning perspective to this issue that can speak about it from the activity and the consequences and concerns in their counties. Please join me in welcoming Dave Church, Commissioner of Planning in Orange County since 2001, and let's see, in the longest decade of my life, I served on the planning board for 7 years in the town of New Paltz. And I first met Dave when he was the executive director of the New York Planning Federation. We also have Dave, along with Dave, we have Fred Eisenberg, who's the commissioner from Sullivan County, Division of Planning, Community Development, and Real Property. She's been there since 2014. And of course, Dennis Doyle, my favorite bartender, and Director of Planning in Ulster County since 2004. And I believe that, Dave, you're going to kick us off, am I right? Among the first questions I think that we're going to consider today is how pervasive are short-term rentals in the communities in your county?
Well, good morning, everyone, and I guess welcome to the New Hamptons, I read here, the Catskills and Hudson Valley. In doing some research, I've noted that our region is one of the 19 for 2019, according to Airbnb, of places in the world worth visiting. So it's driving a lot of this demand and market sector. I want to give a little context on this issue of short-term rentals in kind of three categories. First will be personal. The second will be regional in the context of housing demands and pressures. And the third will be what's going on that might be somewhat unique in Orange County for that context as well. Personally, when I'm not working, I've been a very satisfied customer of booking short-term rentals in many states, many countries, and all seasons. I have to admit my sister, who's disabled, is also a participant in the gig economy, and she's managing several short-term units in southern Vermont, where I grew up. So it's been a very successful experience in that regard personally, and it's that context that I bring to that. For the region, housing's been an acute issue for many years. some people in the room participated in and are aware of. Approximately 10 years ago, Dutchess, Orange, and Ulster counties co-commissioned a regional housing needs assessment, and we've done follow-up work in that regard. That assessment showed a housing deficit across all sectors. It was pretty profound and got worse or more acute as you went down in income levels, and was profoundly acute when it came to all types of rentals. At one point before the housing bubble in Orange County, we could not track for about 12 months, we could not track a single new rental unit being permitted in Orange County for nearly 14 months in the mid-aughts. And so that remains a pressing issue, market-based as well as workforce or affordable housing-based rentals across all sectors. It's only gotten aggravated, and I want to emphasize we need to use all the tools that are available to make more units available for the people that live and work and visit here. And that deficit appears to be getting only more acute with the presence of the dominance of some short-term rentals in particular sectors. In Orange County, we don't seem to be on the cutting edge of this as much as here we are in Ulster County. While Orange County has double the population of Ulster County, it's a population comparable to the whole state of Vermont. We only have about a third, according to most recent statistics of the various digital housing hosts in Ulster County, and comparably about a third of the bookings. However, we have a number of dynamics going on in the housing market that are really calling attention. And when I try to check with my peers, with local officials, with assessors, and with others, I'm going to talk a little bit about what on the housing sector is the more pressing issue. So we're kind of agnostic right now on short-term housing. It's good, it's bad. There seem to be two primary issues at play that I'll talk about a little bit, and I'm sure my peers will talk more about as they deal with this directly. One is the sort of fair, level playing field. There are those people in the market or other housing sectors that have to comply with permitting and licensing and taxation filings, and short-term rentals, whether it be Airbnb or glamping.com, Tenter, whatever it may be, merely don't have to deal with most of this. Orange County addressed that issue last year in reaching an agreement with the primary booker, Airbnb, for getting those taxes paid. In 2018, we got from our occupancy tax a little shy of $14 million. And we have in Orange County what's really a hotel construction boom. In the Newburgh area, Middletown area, down towards the Harriman area, and some scattering elsewhere. There's not a month that goes by with someone not proposing to construct a new conventional hotel. And that seems to be the principal lodging dynamic that's going on in Orange. Second, we have a phenomena in housing that's unique but also shared by our peers. We have a rival in the last 10, 15, 20 years of a series of religious-based communities, if I can call them that. You may be well aware of the Curious Joel, now town of Palm Tree phenomenon in Orange County. That community is still maybe the fastest statistically for gross population growth, the fastest growing community east of the Mississippi River, based on census estimates. In its early years, it literally doubled in population every year, and that's plateaued off to more recently. But right now, if it weren't for Curious Joel, I suspect, and the growth there, Orange County would actually be relatively stagnant in terms of population growth. And that's true in the larger region as well, where some of our peers are actually losing population in the midst of all this. But we also have 2 Hutterite communities, several Buddhist communities, including a place called Dragon Springs outside of Port Jervis, which is founded by followers of Falun Gong. Anyone who's gone to their world-famous dance troupe appearances, they live and train outside of Port Jervis. That's likely to be a wholesale new village in fairly short order just north of Port Jervis. We have a Watchtower community in Warwick, which led to the diaspora essentially of the Jehovah's Witnesses out of Brooklyn. And we're, of course, right next to the one in my hometown, which is in the town of Shotgun, just over the border in Ulster County. That phenomena of this kind of wholesale, large-scale residential development has led to a kind of allergy or opposition at the community and municipal level to what we refer to as any kind of high-density housing. That's the most pressing issue right now in Orange County in housing. The complement or discomplement of this already in a hole deficit-wise for certain sectors of housing, notably rentals, and this opposition that's now translating into codes for any kind of new substantive housing construction based on a fear that it'll essentially be flipped or developed by religious-based organizations and therefore turn the community. Short term, we have by Airbnb statistics, as I said, about a third of what Ulster County's seeing and comparable to Dutchess and a little more than Sullivan County, but comparable to Sullivan County as well. The response to short-term housing seems to be more what I'll call neighborhood-based impacts. A rental goes rogue one weekend, it's noisy, there's too much parking, those kinds of neighborhood-based complaints, and a reaction at the municipal level to do something about this. And a discovery is by community leaders that we didn't even know they were out there. So there's been some reaction, particularly on the regulatory side, to address these, particularly in the notion that they at least should be treated equally to other kinds of lodging and housing. You need to get a permit, you need to comply with zoning, you need to be registered, you may need to renew that, you need to have certain safety features, meet simple building code requirements. There's also been incidents in all our counties, I suspect, and certainly in Orange, of emergency services responses. A fire, the occupants don't know what to do for unapparent reasons, and the first responders don't know how to get a hold of the owner or the manager of the property, and are frustrated. So that has led to our town of Blooming Grove, which is in kind of central Orange County. According to the Poughkeepsie Journal article, was the first in the Hudson Valley to regulate these. And they actually flatly banned rentals of less than 30 days. They've subsequently created a permitting process for those, but their reaction was, till we get a hold on this, we're just not going to let you do this unless you're renting for 30 days or more. Town of Warwick is the most recent entry into the management through zoning or local rules for these kinds of uses. They've taken the approach, which seems completely sensible to those of us, that you should have some basic standards for health and safety in the facility. You should register and seek a permit, if you want to call it that, with the town, which would allow the town to have an inspection and be able to enforce noncompliance with certain standards. And that should be re-upped annually, particularly so that they know who to contact and they can check on an annual basis what conditions are out there. So we've been advocating that. We also have some unique communities that are concerned about other impacts. We have a handful. I'll use Greenwood Lake as an example. Greenwood Lake is a village on a lake. The lake has water quality problems. It's vegetation growth and algal problems. Those are contributed to probably based on research by phosphorus loading from septic systems, because the communities that are on Greenwood Lake haven't not been able to afford the ability for centralized sewage treatment. So they've taken an impact-based approach with these uses that until they can figure out how the impact will be from septic loading as a consequence of increased occupancy in historic homes, they're taking a moratorium approach on that. So a little bit of context. Orange is learning about this. We kind of settled the taxation question, at least with the primary booker. We're looking at what the others might be, and we're expecting that more and more communities are going to be looking to regulate these through common tools available under zoning.
Hello. I'm going to try and do this from here. Sullivan County is a bit more rural than its neighbors. We're all the way out west on the spectrum. We're considered a Hudson Valley community, but our river is not the Hudson, it's the Delaware. We're also more economically distressed than the other counties in the region. There was a study done a couple of years ago that of the 7 mid-Hudson counties, Sullivan was the only one that exhibited economic distress countywide. And I mention this because it colors the county's perception and reception to things like new development and short-term rentals. So while there may be communities out in Orange that are banning them, that hasn't quite, level of concern hasn't quite reached Sullivan. We're on a bit of a spectrum. When David Sager from Monticello was up here on the panel, he talked about gentrification as, you know, something that actually might be a good thing, you know. And investment in your community and new businesses are, you know, they are generally good and welcome until they're not, until it's too much. It's really a spectrum, and you know, Sullivan is at a different point on the spectrum than our neighbors to the east. So we have, actually Sullivan's history has been one of hospitality. So for decades, everyone's familiar with the Borscht Belt and Mrs. Maisel, if you're not, Dirty Dancing. Sullivan County was, you know, developed as a tourism county, and that's been our identity for decades, even when all of the hotels were gone. And actually, when I moved up to the county about 5 years ago, there weren't many left, maybe 1, 2. There's an article from the Times in 1953 that said at that point we had 500 hotels. So people are probably familiar with Bethel Woods, site of the former Woodstock Festival. That was developed as a way of bringing more economic development to the county, and for a long time, you know, there was an idea that, you know, people would come up and they would stay, but with no hotels, there really weren't places to stay. So Airbnb filled an important need or niche. Now we have Resorts World Casino, the Alder Hotel built next to it, the Cartwright Resort and Water Park. We have a new Ayurvedic Wellness Center. All of these hotels have really just come online in the past 2 years, and that has stimulated further hotel development. So the concern, as David said, is really more about a level playing field and making sure that the new investments in hospitality are successful and not undercut by Airbnbs. That said, we do have about 750. Interestingly enough, they are scattered throughout the county. There's been a sense that Western Sullivan, with the communities along the upper Delaware River have been growing more as our second home and tourism communities. When you see articles about the Catskills, spending a weekend up in Sullivan, it's really those communities that are highlighted and mentioned. So it was interesting to me to see that our Airbnbs are really sprinkled throughout the county, and they range in quality. They range from your 5-bedroom house on a lake to a bedroom with a single bed in a house somewhere. And so the concern, when there is a concern, is really about the level of quality and code enforcement and risk. We don't want people coming into units that are not up to code. Because we're rural, we don't want people coming into units where if they do have to call 911, they don't know the address. They can't tell anyone where they are. So those are the kinds of concerns and regulations that are starting to be considered and bandied about. We have one community that's adopted short-term rental regulations, and comparable to what David said, they have to register, they have to be inspected, they have to pay a fee. It's $100. It gets renewed every year. But that's just one community. There are a few others in the pipeline looking to follow suit, and I suspect, comparable to the way regulations came in for solar farms or cell phone towers. You get a new type of use, and zoning takes a while to respond. It's like, oh, there's something new, we have to write regulations about it, and then communities, few are early adopters, and then more join. I suspect we'll see that happening with Sullivan. With respect to the room tax, in an economically distressed area, actually the room tax is the primary concern. Are we getting our room tax? And we were the first county to make an agreement with Airbnb. So, we have revenue from them coming in. And then recently, the county just subscribed to a service called Host Compliance. That's how I know there are 750. They claim to, search the internet for, I think, there are something like 125 different platforms out there for short-term rentals. Obviously, Airbnb is the biggest and most well-known, but there are lots and lots of others. They claim to go through them all and to be able to provide a report with addresses. So we've signed up for that. We're paying for that with our room tax funds, and we're hoping to, get a handle on where those 750 units are. Additionally, the county has a local law that requires them to register with the county, and right now we have about 250 registered. So there's an expectation and a plan that when we do get these 750 addresses, that the county treasurer's office will then reach out to the remaining 500 and say, hey, are you aware there's a local law and we need you to register, and start dealing with them directly. That data will also be used to compare to the revenues that are coming in from Airbnb, because Airbnb provides numbers of nights, but they don't provide numbers of units or their locations. So, we'll be putting 2 and 2 together to sort of as a check on Airbnb. With respect to the impact on actual housing, and affordable housing regulations, there hasn't been that much of a concern, because primarily the units that are being put up are generally second homes anyway. So there's a sense that they're not being shifted from workforce housing to Airbnb, but they might be actually the inventory in has started to tighten up, and Airbnb has contributed to that. And it's generally been seen as a good thing in areas where you have hamlets that have, high rates of vacancies and homes sitting on the market for, 2 and 3 years and 400 foreclosures every year. A little tightening of the market is generally seen as a positive thing, and so that's been welcome. And we haven't had the NIMBYism with respect to rental housing. I mean, certainly we do in some places, but last year in one of our denser villages, Monticello, where David came from, there were 3 projects with 700 units that were working their way through the pipeline, mostly approved. So we don't know when they'll be built, but certainly in a supply and demand situation, 700 new apartments is going to offset our, and any impacts from 750 Airbnbs. And with that, I will pass it to Dennis.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. First of all, thanks to the Benjamin Center for the invitation, and thanks for Guy Kempe for sort of giving us a question and answer session the other day to make sure we were ready to talk about this. And thanks to Dave for reminding me that I'm the smaller county from a population perspective than Orange. That's always appreciated. The word disruptor is often used when we start talking about short-term rentals situations, and there's others disruptors in the county. The other thing I would like to talk about a little bit is the fundamental shift in the way leisure and travel industry individuals are spending their money and how they're spent and where they go and what they do. What that's meant for Ulster County is essentially that the idea of essentially seek and you shall find, or seek for yourself, has been a lot more prevalent in the county in terms of how people come to the county and how they stay in the county. What that's meant is that we have been able to essentially increase our tourism revenues to almost $450 million a year. Part of that has been the ability essentially to use short-term rentals to do your overnight stays. In addition, we've also seen a lot of active recreational uses being done, as well as where people go to do their special events. I don't know about the other counties, but in Ulster County, I can tell you that the event arenas have changed dramatically from where they were even 10 years ago, with the number of people that want to have weddings in fields, barns, or anything else besides a normal wedding venue that you would think of exploding exponentially. And what that's meant is that with that is these things are taking place in areas where there aren't any hospitality facilities. And so the short-term rental folks have benefited from that. One of the things that we've done in looking at short-term rentals is our local law essentially provides for the short-term rental folks and other lodging facilities to deal directly with the county and register with the county and pay. So we don't have an agreement with Airbnb, and currently the local law would not allow us to sign that agreement as opined by the county attorney's office. What that would mean is that we're out there trying to find out how many short-term rentals there are, whether they're registered with us or not. And so we've engaged a company that does similar to host compliance to look at the short-term rental addresses and areas. And they pick up not only just those folks that are doing house sharing, but also the other entities that use Airbnb as an advertising platform. But I will tell you that in Ulster County, we lead the region. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,500 verified units in the county are going through short-term rentals, and they take all kinds of different venues, including non-owner occupied housing, owner-occupied housing, or primary residence leasing of rooms, as well as bed and breakfasts, and even in some instances, some of the inns that use that. Those communities that have the most are typically within the mountainous communities of Ulster County, anything sort of west of Route 209, if you know where that is, into the Catskills. And quite frankly, if you look at that and you think about where the Catskills were in the early 1900s, you can start to think about the use of farmhouses and informal places to stay in the Catskills was the hallmark before the major hotels came in. And it was still part of that economy in the past. So it's almost going back to the future to a certain extent with respect to what the Catskills are experiencing now. But along with that comes a concern with respect to public health and safety, and yes, the ability to connect taxes, and finally the discussion with respect to what does that do with respect to the affordability of the housing stock within these communities, and also, quite frankly, as we move down into the valley within the more built-up areas of the county. Most of the communities that we have about 5 communities that have regulations or going through the process of getting regulations with respect to short-term rentals, are dealing first with the quality of life issues. And those are, and public safety issues. And those literally are essentially ensuring that there's an inspection on an annual basis, and that people understand, and some of the issues that were talked about before, understand how to respond to emergencies. And one of the things that we're urging communities to do is to license these so that you have bad actors that are consistently dealing with police presence as being required, that effectively the next time the license comes due, you can withhold the license. We're also, quite frankly, urging people to deal with the issue of non-owner occupied or primary residence versus non-primary residence differently in each individual community. In the town of Woodstock, that is essentially resulted in a cap on non-owner occupied residential units being used for short-term rentals. What this has tried to do is essentially move the short-term rentals out of an investment option and more into a residence option, and the housing, to make sure that the housing sells on that basis. The last thing we're having discussions about is what do we do about multifamily units, those units that have 3 or more. Should we even think about allowing short-term rentals in these units, because they would displace renters for a great deal of the time, given what rents are in Ulster County compared to what you can get in rentals, in short-term rentals. We have super hosts in Ulster County that rent for $3,000 a night. We have typical rentals somewhere in the neighborhood between $150 to $250 a night within the county. And if we compare that to what rents are in the county for houses and or for apartment buildings, you can see that there's a quick economic choice that could be made absent some public intervention with respect to the need for regulation. One of the things one of the reasons I started this by talking about the ability of us to grow our tourism industry is there's a cottage industries that are springing up with respect to how to deal with short-term rentals that are non-owner occupied. There are, if you go into some of these communities, there are businesses literally that handle the rental, handle the cleanup, handle any of the complaints, that they respond to the complaints. So they're almost like short-term rental managers that exist and have staffs in these communities that are working with these short-term rental folks and are available to them to use. I think long-term, it's the ability to find a balance in terms of driving the economy and opportunity areas that short-term rentals represent versus the need to essentially preserve the housing stock and to essentially make sure that the housing stock is affordable and available to those folks that we need in the community to work for our businesses and to essentially make sure that those things that the apartment units are available for the lower and moderate income individuals. We're not seeing a great deal of concern yet with respect to this, but we are seeing some of the larger short-term rental facilities being bought up and owned by LLCs, limited liability corporations. And we're seeing the ability of some of the major players to buy multiple houses, so that when we propose, for example, limits on owner occupancy or non-owner occupancy, we'll have individuals show up into the community that own 5 or 6 units in the community, houses in the units that they're simply using for short-term rentals. One of the challenges is, and it was mentioned before, is how do you deal with short-term rentals in areas that are dependent in some instances on second homes. Short-term rentals allow the second homeowner to essentially purchase a home and maintain a home a lot more readily than they can if they're not allowed the short-term rental. We're still working that out, trying to figure out how that moves through the regulatory process. We don't want to stifle that innovation as compared to some of the work in the more urbanized areas of the county, where you want to think about the ability essentially to preserve that home for actual full-time renters or full-time owners, rather than allow it to deal with short-term rentals. For a definitional standpoint, if anybody doesn't know what short-term rentals are, it's less than 30 days. And that's fine. I'm done. Thank you.
So thank you all. One of the things that struck me about your comments is that they all had a couple of things in common, and I really appreciated, Freddie, your reference point about the history of hospitality in the Catskills. That language really struck me, and also hearing from you, David, that there's a sort of a hotel building boom going on in Orange County, which I think I've observed happening to some extent in Ulster County. I wonder if this is a case of the traditional lodging market following Airbnb or the short-term rentals to build in our counties. And while you're talking about that, if you're inclined, I'm going to invite the members of the audience that are so inclined to participate in this conversation to join us at the microphone. Any comments about the hotel boom, and do we think that, I don't honestly know about Ulster County and the extent to which we're seeing approvals of new lodging, but I perceive that it's a significant new industry really sort of re-emerging in our counties. Thoughts?
I'll jump in. Sullivan is also having a bit of a hotel boom. I mentioned the sort of majors with the casino and the water park, but we've also had in our western part of the county, similar to Airbnbs, people buying up smaller, I guess smaller guest houses and creating, for lack of a better word, hipster style, small hotels. We have new luxury hotels being developed in the middle part of the county. And your point about the market following Airbnbs, I think, is a good one, because certainly, out west where we're having some of that smaller, almost like an independent chain, throughout the area. The second home and Airbnb industry has sparked the revitalization of some of our smaller hamlets and downtowns. They've brought back, they've sparked the farm-to-table restaurants and the cideries and the breweries, and I think the hotels are following that. So.
Is it on? Yes. In Orange County, the hotel boom is probably related to a couple factors. One is we have this sort of plethora of highway access. If you can vision the geography, Orange County has this triangle of intersecting interstates, I-84, the Thruway, and Route 17, soon to be Interstate 86. So we have a significant transient population basically passing through, which includes a fair amount of cargo movement, so that drives some of the hotel demand. We do have a couple unique situations. For upstate New York, we have two of the primary destinations for tourism, so in Orange County tourism is probably more specific site destination driven than the kind of activity that we see in Ulster, where people are coming up for an experience and doing a variety of things. Those two things are pretty much anything to do at West Point Military Academy, which is overrun many weekends and has very little lodging locally, so it's driving the hotel industry. The other is Woodbury Common, which, if you're not aware, is the largest retail outlet complex in the world. There are billboards about Woodbury Common, I'm told, in downtown Tokyo. And there's a significant housing demand for that seems more met by sort of conventional hotel lodging. So it's kind of the transient population in these specific destinations, and a third's joining. They claim they're going to open next year. I think it's going to take a little longer, but we will be the home of Legoland outside of Goshen, which estimates multi-million visitors annually, many of which may look to stay overnight.
Dennis, want to join us? Yep. My friend Laura Walls is at the microphone. Laura.
Thank you all. This is a great and very important conversation for us in Gardner. We didn't realize until we started considering a short-term rental law that our current code does not allow for short-term rentals right now. And while that's just something that we'll be working around, I shared that just in case anybody wants to check how their code is written now. If somebody came in and proposed one, would there be a basis for allowing it? The other thing I want to share about it is that I think that, at least from my point of view, we're having a very good conversation about it at our town board meetings. We're working with research. We're very concerned about the nature of community and preserving how it is that we all interact with each other. Our rural roads are very, very important to us. They're an extension of our individual communities. It's a lot of walking and biking, and people stand outside and are having a conversation. And, so how do we preserve that sort of activity that's indigenous? And while I'm talking about indigenous, we also have in Gardner a history of guest houses. Back in the day, particularly like during the Depression and thereafter, people would open their homes. There was no air conditioning in the city, and people would come up and they would live for a couple of, 2-3 months or a bunch of weeks in somebody's home. And it's not that I am against, and I don't believe most people in Gardner are against having short-term rentals. Our sticking point seems to be whole house rentals. And I personally have been working on affordable housing since the early 80s. Dennis will remember the first ever Ulster County Housing Task Force. And there have been many such initiatives over the decades since, and it remains a problem. So for me, personally, it's very important that we don't let short-term rentals compromise our ability, as difficult as it is, to provide for affordable housing. So that gets us quickly, I'll end, but to the issue of whole house rentals. One compromise that I think that we as a board have come up with is a couple of weeks a year, so that maybe it helps you to subsidize your tax bill while you go on vacation. But investment housing is very much a concern. And I've done some research, but I haven't been able to find any good quantifiable research on the impacts of whole house and investment house use for short-term rental. And the other one last piece component of that is when you rent out a bedroom or a couple of bedrooms in your house, you give some breakfast, and then the rest of the time the residents or your tenants or visitors are out in the community spending money. When you do your whole house, they're stopping at the grocery store, they're packing up, and they're just, hunkering down. But mostly I want to know if there's any research, can you forward it to me? Thank you.
Dennis, you want to?
Yeah, we haven't found anything that is specific to the county, and we think that the best way to do it is to look at how housing tracks within your community rather than to think that you're going to find national research or research that's out there from someone else that's applicable. I would say that with respect to community, one of the things that you really need to be concerned about and you start to think about is what they call dark neighborhoods, where you have multiple houses within neighborhoods that are essentially non-owner occupied and they're dark for quite a while, and then that creates their own issues with respect to that. And we see that in some instances even within the second home community, where you have the ability essentially, although the security systems have gotten a lot better, but communities become concerned about the ability of these homes in the rural areas that essentially are not occupied all week long.
One of the things that I like to do is remind people that when we're talking about the short-term rentals, we're not typically talking about units of housing that I would include in an inventory of affordable housing. and these are these are market rate units. I wonder if Dave or Fredo would like to jump in on that.
I think for the most part you're correct, but as I said earlier, what we've seen in Sullivan is really a huge variety, and some are quite modest. So I'm not sure the statement is universally true, largely true.
Yeah, I think in the interest of doing some assessment and noting there's been some discussion about zoning, and I think the Kingston official referenced form-based code. I'm kind of an advocate of performance-based approaches to local policy, and if it goes that far to regulation, where you actually look at needs and then impacts and base your policies and approaches based on that assessment. And at this point, particularly for my work, I'm not sure I would consider short-term units part of an affordable housing needs assessment for a community. It's a different aspect, and I'll repeat, what we already know, and there's some professionals in the room, is there's an acute deficit of affordable housing in this region. And we need to address that regardless of the role of short-term housing. And that deficit, I believe, has gotten worse since some of us have examined it. And we need to step up and start doing some aggressive measures to address that, or I think this region's going to change quite dramatically.
All right, I appreciate that. I believe in Eve. Eve, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Hi, I'm Eve Walter. So I'm just wondering, from each of your counties, since you talk about, and we know that a lot of the pressure of these short-term housing is on the towns and villages, their police and fire departments, what actions do you take to ensure that all of the revenue that you get from the short-term housing go back to the towns and villages to help recoup those costs? Thanks.
Are you talking specifically the room tax revenue?
Yeah.
Okay, so in Sullivan, as I mentioned earlier, the big concern is that we are collecting the room tax. That said, room tax dollars are specifically allocated toward tourism promotion. So there's no nexus between, using those funds to support other purposes. And as far as I know, there's no sales tax collected on these rooms yet.
Right, so I'm aware that it goes to tourism, so I'm just wondering what thoughts you have in your county to make sure that they do get back down to the villages and towns, especially those that are hit the hardest by it, because they are, again, it's their fire, their police, in addition to their infrastructure. So as we move forward and there's more and more of this and we're thinking of regulations, how are we thinking about how to, again, support the towns and villages that are supporting these very houses? So I'm thinking forward, not what you're doing now, but what can we be doing in the future?
Makes perfect sense. Orange County has a sales tax sharing agreement with our municipalities, and we have three cities, all of which have the potential of charging their own sales tax. So part of the agreement is to offset the prospect that might happen. So we take an approach that we essentially bundle county revenue and share it back through the sales tax structure. As Fred has said, with the occupancy tax, we treat it as general revenue, but the legislative agreement was that would be moved back into tourism promotion principally.
And that's the same in Ulster County. We have a sharing agreement with the towns for sales tax. I would say that, from a standpoint of community impacts, that there's an ability of the community essentially to raise the funds if that's what if they think it's unduly impacting their police and fire, and that's through a licensing process. And you charge a fee for that licensing. And then you treat those folks that essentially are bad actors within that by removing their license. There's an opportunity to do it that way, if it becomes a concern in terms of cost of services.
The first short-term rental regulations in our county, the one for the town of Callicoon, charges $100 per unit. However, that's primarily being used to support the actual inspections of the unit and the cost of the code enforcement. There are some communities, where there may be 40 short-term rental units, but the code enforcement officer is there half a day a week. Clearly, if there's going to be an actual, enforcement of short-term rental regs, they're going to need to up that and hire it. So that's what the fee will be used for.
Thank you. Is there a comment or question?
I was wondering, can the tax assessor do a new assessment if property goes to a short-term rental?
Well, for assessors, as I understand it, income potential could be factored into your property tax assessment. Has it happened yet in the culling of some sample assessors that I've talked to? The short-term rentals, they have not started to do that. They may have done it if you're a conventional lodge, certainly hotels. Maybe the beginning we've seen some bed and breakfasts, but not the short-term rentals.
And I think that's the same in Ulster.
But they can go based on income on the property, can't they, the value of the property? Or not?
There's some fair amount of guidance out there for assessors on measuring income potential of what we can loosely call commercial activity. And they could apply that factor into updated assessments, but I'm not seeing that yet.
Okay, thank you.
My friend Rennie Scott Childress would ask me to ask you if there are any comments or questions.
Hi, my name is Tamara Murray, and I'm the co-chair of the Ulster County Lodging Coalition. My questions have to do with the tax agreements that Orange and Sullivan have signed with Airbnb. And I'm curious, for Sullivan, you had mentioned that you were using host compliance. Are you using that as a way to audit the numbers that Airbnb is providing, or actually the check? Because since Airbnb basically doesn't, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't provide any type of reporting to verify their numbers. And is there any type of precedence or plan for what to do if host compliance gives you a different number and it doesn't equal to what Airbnb is giving to you? And my second question, kind of tagging on to that, is there hasn't been any regulatory or legislative stuff passed at a state level. And so by signing these third-party agreements, is there any concern that it kind of legitimizes the short-term rental industry and might cause the state to drag its heels even longer on leveling the playing field with regulation and legislation?
Our agreement with host compliance is fairly new, so this is new territory for us. We haven't even gotten the data yet, with the exception of the preliminary number. You're right, we do not get a full report from Airbnb. There's a sense that what we might be able to do is do some numbers crunching with, as I said, there's a discrepancy between units that register with the county and the number on host compliance. We'll see where the numbers come in terms of addresses and for Airbnbs and do it that way. New territory. Sorry.
So I just want to address one of the three reasons that we have engaged at the community level with respect to some of the regulations as it relates to short-term rentals. Is not only as it relates to the tax, but also some of the public safety issues. But from a tax perspective, what we've done is combine essentially the zoning process with the ability to essentially the county to know that you're renting rooms. We don't know what you're renting them for, how often, but at least we know you're in the business. And what we've done is we've said to the communities, as part of your zoning scheme and your licensing scheme, require them to register with the county so that the county has a record that they're in the business. Now, granted, that could change month to month or week to week in some instances, but at least we would know that if they're registered at the local level, they're registered at the county level. And that gives us the ability essentially to move out into the community. And we're sending letters right now. The finance department is sending letters as the registrations come in from the community level, and as we understand what they are from the company that's helping us, we're sending letters out informing them that they need to register with us and pay a room tax. I will tell you there's some surprises in that. We actually sent a letter to an individual and informing him that or her that the property was being used as a short-term rental. She called us from Italy and basically said no, and then we figured out that her subletter was essentially subletting the sublet as a short-term rental.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is going to need to be our last question for this panel. Welcome.
I'm representing the short-term renters of Gardner. Turn the microphone. Okay. So basically, thank you very much for all your expertise to hear this over 4 counties, that short-term renters do not infringe upon the affordable housing. I think that's a very important point to make. The other thing is that the 3 weeks, what is proposed in Gardner or in Woodstock, 26 weeks, that's a very arbitrary number. Do you have any expertise on that, where we're going with this? Because this arbitrary 3-week, 2-week, 1 day, where is this going?
Well, I just wanted to correct the statement in terms of the impact on affordable housing. I would put it more in the unknown category, at least for the context of Orange County, that has no impact. As to next steps, we have openly talked about perhaps revisiting this housing needs assessment, either individually or collectively for a region. And perhaps we need to think about this new sector being factored in or not into that analysis. So from my perspective, we need to know more. It's kind of popped up quickly. It was kind of a nice little thing that my peers have noted is reflective of kind of the historic nature of weekend and seasonal housing here. So we kind of took it as, hey, that's kind of nice. It's happening again. And now that it's a meaningful part of the sector, I think we need to learn more.
It's all about supply and demand, as Randy said, and Beacon as well. People want to come up here, they don't have anywhere to stay. Like, for example, in New Paltz, we have 1 hotel, 2 hotels. We have the lodge up there. But that's only a couple of rooms. So there is more demand to it. So why shouldn't we serve that demand? Because it helps the community as well.
I think the point is taken. We'll take our one last question or one last comment.
Thank you. Again, thanks for your expertise. Got a lot of information so far. I'm the assessor for the town of Woodstock, and we are like the canary in the coal mine. Yeah. 400 average, I think, Dennis, hosts with 33,000 guests coming per year. That's 2018. And we have a population of like 6,600 year-round. So we've seen, as a tourist town, a tripling of a population in the summer particularly. And what it can do is displace year-round residents, let alone medium and low-income renters. And I don't think there are any left. They've left. A couple of them were in my office a few weeks ago, and I just said to myself, there was a fight that broke out in the building department between a hippie conspiracy theorist who is beloved in the town, of course, and protected. He's a feature that tourists would come and look at, and admire for the, alternative lifestyle they all themselves would love to have. And here he is in a fight with a short-term renter, host, who has 4 properties in town, 4 different houses she rents out. She reported him to the building department for having a generator and a wood pile next to her illegal shed that she rents out on weekends for $150 a night near the stream of one of her 4 houses. She rents the house. She illegally converted the shed, one of many in our town, into a short-term rental and accused this long-term hippie of annoying her guests, which was true, and she had a legitimate gripe, but then she was reported. She got 14 violations, he got 12. And they just, by accident, came into the building department at the same time. His girlfriend was so incensed, she pushed the host into the building department desk, the code enforcement officer's desk. She reported it to the judge, to the cops came, the whole big thing broke out. And I heard someone say later that the short-term, the people will rise and change this predicament we're in here in Woodstock, that everything will go back to an even playing field. But that's where rules and regulations. We do have in place a short-term rental application process and a law that the town adopted last month. But it's not enough. Any permission is too much permission, as far as I'm concerned. When a town is under such stress, all you have to do is visit. No, I'm not inviting anyone to visit, actually. So, but I mean, we are really, people are, speculating what STRs, particularly Sullivan County, what they can do to affect the community. Well, a lot, and I'm just, every day I'm reminded about it. And, property values go up. People have been asked about, what's going to happen to my taxes if I rent a room or 2? Well, nothing really. It's called the capitalization approach. You'd have to have a commercial property of 4 or more units for it to really kick in. No assessor would get away with raising your taxes for 1 or 2 room rentals. It used to be the opposite, and I'll finish with this, that residential, single-family residences per square foot sold for much more than 2 or 3 family homes. People weren't into being landlords. They were into being second homeowners or residents, They didn't want to be landlords. There was no desire, and the sale prices reflected that. Now it's turned around because there's so much more money to be made by short-term rentals than there are by long-term. So as a landlord myself, I've been tempted, but I love my tenants, so I keep them.
Well, thanks so much for that comment. You've reminded me of a story that comes from Woodstock. As you know, RUPCO developed a project of affordable housing in Woodstock, and it was recounted to me at the time that maybe 20 years earlier, a supervisor of the town of Woodstock stood up in a meeting and declared, "Woodstock has plenty of affordable housing, but all of it costs too much." And with that thought in our minds, join me in thanking our panel.
Hi, my name is KT Tobin, and I'm the Associate Director of the Benjamin Center for Public Policy Initiatives. Thank you. I'm also a faculty in the Department of Sociology, and in full disclosure, also the Deputy Mayor of the Village of New Paltz. My job is to start off this panel and moderate it. I'm going to do that by setting the stage with, by providing you with some information about a forthcoming cost of living study that we have soon coming out. And then we have a nice varied group of different stakeholders here to wrap up, react, and comment on what we've heard so far today. So first I'm just going to go through my little intro talking about our forthcoming study, and then I'll introduce our panelists. I do also want to say it's very nice to see such a varied array of stakeholders here today. I see local government people, I see nonprofit people, policy decision makers in different places, and private sector people as well. Which is a goal of the Benjamin Center. When we do these convenings, we want people who may be traditionally siloed and in their different spaces to come together so we can talk about these things together and so that we can problem solve together. So it's nice to see the mix of people that came today. So I'm gonna step way back and sort of broaden the net about what we're talking about, and actually Dave Church give you some evidence to his statement a few minutes ago about how we have an acute housing affordability crisis in our country, in our state, and in our region. And why do we use the word acute, and why do we use the word crisis? And hopefully by the end of my few minutes here, you'll see why those are accurate words to use to describe the situation. Because housing costs in our country, in our region, in our state, well exceed what's deemed affordable by conventional measures. Multiple times today we've heard this. Folks in the affordable housing world know that if you're using, the standard metric is if you're using more than 30% of your monthly income, that's not affordable. And according to the census in 2017, nationwide, about half of rental households and 3 in 10 mortgage homes needed to allocate more than 30% of their income for housing. And New York's pretty bad on this front. Our state is ranked 4th highest in the percentages of both renters and homeowners with unaffordable housing costs. We have seen since the recession, if you look at the time period between 2009 and 2017, in most states, including New York, there was a decline in the overall percentage of owner-occupied households who needed these larger portions of their income to cover their housing costs. However, the same cannot be said for those who don't own their homes. Looking just at our region, and this study, those of us that study and roll in the Hudson Valley and the mid-Hudson Valley know that the definition changes depending on who's doing the studying and looking. And for this study, the Mid-Hudson region includes Columbia, Dutchess, Greene, Orange, Putnam, Rockland, Sullivan, and Ulster counties. And in this region, about 4 in 10 households with mortgages need 30% or more of their income to pay for housing costs. And the numbers are even worse for tenants. About 6 in 10 tenant households require 30% more of their earnings to pay for their housing costs. This means that an estimated 122,000 households in the Mid-Hudson region need 30% of more of their income to pay for their mortgage or rent, including approximately 83,000 households who need to use 50% or more of their earnings for household costs. So we all know and live this anecdotally. Shouldn't be a surprise probably to many in this room. It wasn't a surprise to us at the Benjamin Center by what we learned when we did our study, what we heard from residents in this forthcoming cost of living study, and here's just some select findings. We asked Mid-Hudson residents about whether or not they felt their communities were affordable, and about half said that their communities were not affordable, including 1 in 10 who said where they live was not affordable at all. So for many, it's a prosperous place, right? People can prosper. But also for many, this prosperity and ability to make ends meet is not broadly shared. Half of our region's residents, approximately 700,000 people, in 250,000 households live paycheck to paycheck. That means they pay their bills and they have no money to put into savings to provide a financial buffer against financial difficulties that might come their way. A majority of Mid-Hudson households have the equivalent of less than 6 months' income saved to cover their living expenses if they lost all their current sources of income. 1 in 5 have no savings at all to fall back on. In paycheck-to-paycheck households, about 3 in 4 have less than 6 months, and over 1/3 have none. So this means we have a lot of households living in precarious situations, and the loss of a job or earnings could spiral down into some really bad times. And that households don't have buffers. Accumulated wealth is extremely important in order to keep people stable financially. Healthcare costs is now one of the #1 reasons in this country why people are bankrupt. It's one of the #1 reasons people are on GoFundMe in this country. Even a car accident, which may be simple to get through in a household where you have a buffer, could totally derail these many households because then you can't get to work and you can't pay for the car, and it just becomes a spiral. And we have so many people living in these precarious circumstances. So nearly 4 in 10 of owner-occupied households live paycheck to paycheck, and that's double for tenants. 8 in 10 tenant households told us that they live paycheck to paycheck. 90% of these households have less than 6 months of savings to live on if they lost all their current income. And about half have no money at all to fall back on if need be. We asked people about community priorities, and we have near consensus on the importance of affordable housing. 95% of residents in the region say affordable housing is important to community well-being, including 6 in 10 who said it was very important. But 3/4 of residents told us that we were doing a pretty bad job on this front, saying only a fair or poor job in providing affordable housing. So this is a bigger social and economic context to what we're talking about today, but it's important to have that context because whether it's rent regulation or control or it's how we deal with short-term housing, what we do is either going to improve these conditions or exacerbate them. It's been really nice to hear in both panels that we don't have a one-size-fits-all kind of thought about this, whether it's, I really like Jack's comments about how we really need to figure out how to customize this for our local communities, and the difference in short-term rentals between helping somebody stay in place so they can afford where they live versus outside investors that's really taking money out of our communities. How do we figure that out with short-term rentals? These are such important conversations to have. So I think it's fair to say that we have an affordability crisis in our region, and one of the primary factors is housing. Crisis isn't defined as intense difficulty or troubles, but it's also defined as a turning point. So I hope we don't let this crisis go to waste, and that we together can form solutions and find solutions based on the statistics and the stories that we heard today, so that whatever we do, whether it's about rent or whether it's about short-term rentals, that we address these issues in a way that remedies the situation that we have, and as I said, doesn't exacerbate this affordability crisis that we're in. Sociologists are always the Debbie Downers. But those are the stats, and that's what we're looking at. I'm now going to have our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll just go on down the line. So we have Carrie Henderson, who's an Airbnb operator. We have Patricia Singh, who is representing Airbnb, and we have Alex Panagiotopoulos from the Kingston's Tenant Union. They're going to speak about who they are, what they do, why they're at this table, and then again we're going to open it up to more questions from the audience. So we'll just go down the table if that works for you all.
Sure, just say a few words.
Sure.
Yeah. My name's Kerry Henderson. I'm an Airbnb operator. Actually, before I was an Airbnb operator, I did short-term rentals. It's just Airbnb wasn't around then. So I've been doing it for over 10 years. As several of our guests have spoken, Short-term rentals are part of the long, storied history of our area, right from the beginning, particularly up in the mountains. I have a place up in beautiful Phoenicia. And I sort of got into it. I'm an opera singer. I've sung all around the world. And at a certain point, my wife and I started to have children, and I didn't really want to travel anymore. But I still wanted to sing opera. I wanted to participate in the community. I founded the Phoenicia Festival of the Voice, but there was no money in that. You know, I've been singing at opera houses, which had provided the income. I didn't want to travel anymore. I wanted to be with my family. And I started this amazing arts festival and got the idea that, well, you know, we had an accessory apartment on our property, and so we started renting that out, and then we built another one, and so we had two, and that actually provided the income for me to look after my family and to do cool things in the community. I went on to start the Kingston Festival of the Arts and Woodstock Festival of Song, and right now I'm creating an art space in Uptown Kingston in a building that I purchased a few years ago. Again, that needs seed money to get going, and so this model of actually doing short-term rentals has provided for my family, and it's been an amazing thing. Sometimes we do short-term rentals. Sometimes people love it so much they stay for a few months. We've had people who've stayed for a few years. So there's nothing clear-cut about this. We have a few spaces, and I would call them flexible term rentals. I don't think they fit into any particular category. A couple don't even have kitchens, so it would be out of the question that they could even be long-term rentals. I think our space, which could be a long-term rental, wouldn't be classified as affordable. If it went on the open market, it would be more like fair market rent. Thank you so much for the organizers for inviting me here. I think hosts are Airbnb hosts, short-term rental hosts are a very, very important part of the community. I think that whenever regulations are mentioned, that the people who are actually going to be regulated against should be included in that. Up in Shandaken, several of my friends are here from the Shandaken Home Sharing Association. Hosts came together and we lobbied the town, and now the town has allowed two participants from the host community to be on the committee that's going to be informing the board as far as regulation. We're not against regulation. We think some sort of basic regulation as far as health and safety and signing up is very fair. So yeah, thanks for having me here today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patricia Singh, and I work at Airbnb on their policy team. I've been there for about 5 years, and I'm actually from Sullivan County, so I love everything you had to say. Yeah. You know, I work in predominantly New York City, but also as well as the Hudson Valley and Catskills region. I've done work with policymakers from Maine to Miami to Vancouver, giving suggestions for policy on how municipalities can really regulate effectively short-term rentals. At Airbnb, we do take regulation very seriously. It is something that we believe in, as long as it's smart and practical for both our community members who use Airbnb and also for the communities in which they exist. Additionally, I work on some of the county voluntary collection agreements, the tax agreements that you are all talking about, so I'm happy to answer questions on that if you have more questions. And, just to kind of address, I know someone had a question about what the state was doing. We are advocating for a comprehensive plan at the state level to kind of address the regulatory framework for short-term rentals in New York City and New York State. We want to be good partners to any municipality, any city that we're in. We want to be able to pay taxes, and we want there to be a clear distinction, and protections for the people who are using Airbnb properly and responsibly, but also that, are taking effect on the bad actors who are not necessarily conducive to a healthy community. So I'm so excited to be here and answer any more questions that you have, but I'll hand it over to Alex.
All right, so I'm Alex from the Kingston Tenants Union. I helped start it with some other people in Kingston. I just want to ask, by a show of hands, who here has heard of redlining or read the Color of Law book that came out a few years ago? And then keep your hands up. Additionally, who here has heard about the legacy of urban renewal and all the trauma that happened from that? All right, so keep your hand up if you believe that if that was happening today, you would do something to stop it. If you think you would do something. All right, so it's happening again today. People in this room have a lot of power, and we have the power to stop what's going on right now. Like KT has said already a bunch of really great macro statistics, but basically 6,000 families in Ulster County give the majority of their paycheck to their landlord. So that means that money is going directly from their boss to their landlord, and they don't get any of it. They don't get to keep most of it. Additionally, some people are kind of confused about like the context of Airbnb in Ulster County in the area. And I called up Patricia, and she gave me the statistics. But basically, Ulster County has the most Airbnb revenue of any county north of New York City by triple. By triple. Airbnb didn't exist 15 years ago. Also, 3 out of every 100 housing units in Ulster County has an Airbnb. We think that about 70% of those, I'm not sure exactly how many, but about 70% are whole housing units. And once again, Airbnb didn't exist 15 years ago. In terms of evictions, the Kingston Tenants Union, we did our own eviction study this year, and we found that they're up 57% in the county since 2013. And in Ulster County, we're on track for the most ever evictions ever recorded this year. And that says nothing about evictions by intimidation, by raising the rent to a level that someone can't just pay it. That's as good as an eviction, or simply not offering a lease renewal. It also says nothing of the situation that we see a lot, where landlords let the building get condemned and then clear out the low-income tenants that are there, and then they fix it up to rent it to a higher-income tenant, or they Airbnb it, or they sell it to an investor. If you own property, you can do whatever you want. But 30% of the people in Ulster County and 55% of the people in Kingston are renters. They don't own property, so they don't have the same agency to enjoy the quality of life improvements and other great things we have going on in Ulster County. Some other stats. Since 2000, median wages have gone down slightly in both Kingston and the county. However, median rents have gone up by 30 to 50%, depending on what kind of housing we're talking about. At the same time, a number of New York City real estate interests, including Neil Bender, Charles Blakeman, and E&M Management, who have documented histories of riding the wave of gentrification, evicting and abusing tenants, setting absurd rents, and sitting on empty buildings for decades, have bought up over 15 buildings in Uptown Kingston, as well as several large apartment complexes around Kingston and in Kingston. And when we talk about stakeholders coming together and having an inclusive process about the future of our community, I've never seen these people at a meeting. They don't need to go to the meeting because they already won. They own everything, and their money does the talking. So there's nothing that we can say to them at a table that would change anything. So I'm here today. The Kingston Tenants Union is part of the New York State Housing Alliance. And what the Housing Alliance and also the National Homes Guarantee movement is pushing for is a guarantee to end homelessness, that everyone deserves housing as a human right. We're pushing for something called decommodification of housing. Homes are built for people to live in. They're not built to generate money forever for people. So if you're profiting for something that people need to live, you're not guaranteed to make profits forever. I mean, I run a business. I went into debt one year. It happens. Like, if you run a business, sometimes you lose some money. We used to have rent control in New York State from 1942 to 1957. Even in Kingston, we had almost full rent control. In 1957, a hearing was held at City Hall to end rent control. Over 100 landlords packed the room. Not a single tenant spoke. At the time, one landlord said that since rent control was implemented, wages had gone up by 15%, while rents had remained flat, and that was unfair. Now contrast that today, rents have gone up by 30 to 50%, while wages have gone down. So I think something needs to happen. So what can we do? So just 3 things really quick. The Emergency Tenant Protection Act, some people talked about that before. That's an incremental thing that we fought really hard to even have the option to have. So of 6,000 apartments in Kingston, that might cover around 1,000 or 1,500 apartments. In addition to that, we already have 1,200 apartments that are considered affordable. They're already subsidized. And what that would do is that what we're finding is tenants don't really have the right to organize right now. They do technically, just like I have the right to go buy a Ferrari, but I can't actually do it because I'd have to give up everything to do it. So what's happening right now is if tenants get seen going into a meeting to speak up for their rights, or if they get photographed at a meeting, some of them get a knock on the door the next day, and they have no legal protection from that landlord jacking up their rent, harassing them, not doing needed repairs. So what the ETPA would do, it would be the largest expansion of rights and rent control to Kingston tenants in over 70 years. We have also round 2 of the rent law fight coming up. This time around, landlords are organizing. They have something called Unshackle Upstate, and they just had a big conference in Utica. So they're going to be fighting, against even the meager protections we won last year. But we're going to keep pushing for more. There's something called good cause eviction that we're trying to get, which says that you can get, basically, if you're in an apartment already, you have the right to lease renewal as long as you're paying your rent and not violating your lease. It would tie rent increases to the consumer price index, and it would give over 3,000 Kingston families the protection they need to organize. The other thing, like I said, Airbnb didn't exist 15 years ago. Now it has 2 to 3% of all of our housing in Ulster County. So that's something that we should probably think about. And then finally, one other concrete proposal that I support is about property taxes. And there's actually a proposal in the state legislature that would lower upstate property taxes by 30%. It's called the New York Health Act. Single-payer health care would kill about 30% of the money we pay in property taxes because so much of our tax dollars go towards paying our share of Medicaid and also paying for public employees' health care and teachers' health care. So instead, the New York Health Care Act would pay for health care through our income taxes, and it would lower property taxes by 30%. It would decouple the relationship between rising health care costs and property taxes, which if you own property or you rent, a big chunk of what you pay goes to paying healthcare costs. So that's something I support, to lower property taxes. And otherwise, thanks for inviting me to this, and I look forward to talking more.
Thanks for that last bit, Alex. I think it exemplifies how so much of this is just so interlocking and the different points of intervention. And I can testify as a former school board member and a village deputy mayor, in our budgets, our healthcare costs for our employees are a huge part of our budgets. And if we could take that out of our budgets, school property taxes, it would allow us so much more space to both reduce taxes and provide more services and take care of other things in our communities. So I guess at this point, if you, I don't know if you have any questions for each other, or if we have a question about anything for our panelists, anything you heard today.
Hi, Valerie Irwin again. Valerie Irwin. Can you hear it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. My ears are weird, so I can't tell. It sounds not hearable. I'm a landlord, student housing in New Paltz. I came today thinking that the short-term housing questions might apply to the student housing because they're generally 1 to 2 year rentals. And then I realized during the last panel that was completely off topic. But I would hope to have another panel discussion in the future that would include, I try to be a really good landlord. I try to make sure I take really good care of my tenants. They stay for years at a time with me. They roll over, they stay with me. We work pretty well with the town and their code enforcement and making sure that what we're providing, the students are getting what they deserve as an investment in their future to go forth and possibly be homeowners. We're trying to create an environment for them to succeed. There are parts about the new law that will make that much harder, and I'm not talking about the security amount, but time frames and notification things. And I would love to see a panel like this done where we could talk about that, which I realize isn't really the topic of today. The second thing I wanted to say goes back to I respect everything Katie does, and we talk about the fact that we have different ideas about social success. I think that with the cost of living study that shows that we have an extreme acute housing crisis, I'm a really strong advocate for the elderly. We have elderly that are being pushed out of our communities. We have in the town housing for the elderly being considered that's going to be lower income than Woodland Pond, that's been on the table for years, that they're struggling to get this thing built. Then there's no place for the elderly to stay when they are out-taxed to be able to stay in the homes they own. One of the things that causes acute housing crisis and people paying 50% of their income to an apartment is the fact that we have no jobs that pay what industry used to create for families that grew up with the expectations that I did. I grew up in a fairly poor, lowest of middle income, multiple children, 5. I grew up in a family of 5 who owned a house. My parents bought their house when they were 25. I grew up with the expectation I would go to college, I would have children. I had my children when I was 20. I owned a house by the time I was 25 and finished my first degree. There's no potential for that in the industry that's provided now. I also expected that job to pay. I never had a job that didn't pay my health insurance. Our health insurance crisis now, we have what I wrote down here as a severe cultural deficit in our modern life that accepts that people are no longer looking to own a home, that all homes are the taxation is so ridiculous that people become in need of affordable housing. Why is that not a focus to find more jobs? People don't want to live like paycheck to paycheck. My grandfather grew up in the backwoods of West Park as a Norwegian immigrant and died a millionaire. He was a postman who played the stock market and owned a bi-level in Highland when he died. That American dream should apply to every single person, the possibility for it. But when we focus on creating more renters and affordable housing for renters instead of creating industry that'll provide jobs with benefits for people to actually succeed and hope to have something that they can put away for, to invest in their future, to have a retirement fund, that's just not there anymore. Why is that not a community focus on a large scale in New York State? I see it succeeding in other states. I travel all over the country. I travel all over the world. I've used Airbnb in all those places. They're awesome. But really, I would like to see New York State starting to succeed with less taxes, more jobs. We've become what I call an entertainment, service, and casino industry. And we're sitting here talking about how that's bringing some jobs, but they're never going to be jobs that people who fall into that lower than medium income are going to be able to put money away on and invest in their own future instead of, some landlord who owns 100, low-income housing units. Let's give them an opportunity to find real jobs that give them a stake in life that help their children succeed, like my parents helped me succeed, like I helped my children succeed. That dream seems to be dissipating, and I would love to see it come back.
I would actually love to speak on that, if that's okay. I thank you for your words. I think in the state of New York, Airbnb has almost 50,000 hosts across the state, and it's a platform that's giving almost 50,000 people the opportunity to use their greatest asset as a resource of economic income. And it's giving people the opportunity to, become a micro entrepreneur and support themselves in that fashion. And I also noticed that you spoke about retirement, and I just wanted to mention that, our fastest growing demographic at Airbnb is actually women over 50, and that's internationally. So, people are looking for a way to make income in a place where they don't necessarily have one, and they're finding it through our platform. So, we're always looking to lift up communities that we're serving. So thank you for your comments.
If you have a question, please come up to the mic. Alex, did you want to say something?
I'll just say, really quick, just in order to make money on Airbnb, you already have to own a home to do that. So it is good. I mean, sure, if you own a home, especially if you're retired, renting out a room or on Airbnb, it's fine. But I'll just say also that there's not a single, even, we talk about New York State being such a bad environment for stuff, but there's not a single county in the entire country where a full-time minimum wage job pays for a 2-bedroom apartment. So there's not a single county in the entire country that has, even in the most conservative slash and burn, low taxed areas, there's not a single place that has figured out how to create enough high-paying jobs where everyone has enough to live. So that's on everyone to figure out, if Ulster County or if our region could somehow outperform the entire country on such a level. I think we have way more control over limiting rents instead of trying to outperform the entire country on wages. But I'll get to the question. Sorry.
Hi. I'm very split on Airbnb. I live in Beacon where musicians and artists supplement their income through Airbnb. But I really appreciate, Alex, how you draw the line between how we historically have divided communities of color and their asset building and their wealth and their equity, and how, honestly, short-term rentals are exacerbating the problem because there is a barrier to access in even preparing your home to be short-term rentable, right? It requires that you have a home, that you have enough equity in the home that you can create a space for guests to come live, right, and be up to code. I think about this, in Newburgh, these beautiful historic houses, but the barrier, even if you own them, and some families of color own them, the barrier to refurbish them and renovate them to a state where they are guest worthy is huge, and there's not the equity in that community to provide for that. So my first question, I've got 2 or 3. My first question is, how can Airbnb work with the local municipalities and communities to kind of ease that gap? I don't know whose job it is. It may not be Airbnb's, right? I don't know who solves that problem, but it is a problem, and it's a problem that exacerbates the wealth gap. And we say we don't want that many renters, but we're giving into a situation where there's not enough housing stock, period. There's a deficit of 3 million across the nation or something. So with this limited housing stock, renters are the reality, right? And then I have read a little bit about the vacant property tax. I'm not sure. I haven't read a lot of studies about how that works. We're talking about investors coming. You mentioned an investor comes, buys 15 properties. A lot of that's happening in a lot of these cities where there's a lot of blight. They buy a property, they don't develop it yet, so it's just sitting there contributing to the blight, not contributing too much. It's not being rented out. Have y'all seen where a vacant property tax has actually worked to kind of move these? No, nobody's. Okay. All right, that's my only question. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Anybody want to respond?
The vacant property tax is a thing that you can do that moves the needle slightly, and it's good. But just the question about how can we get more Airbnbs, I feel, in my opinion, I feel like that's asking to solve a problem caused by capitalism with more capitalism. And what I would be asking is how can we Because, like, for example, in Kingston, there was just a building that was renovated that was vacant for a long time. It's an old, I think, historic building. And the only way that it got renovated was because of Airbnb, because the person that bought it knew how to fix it up, and knew that if they turned it into 4 short-term apartments and ran it like a hotel, Airbnb hotel, that they would recoup their investment. And what we're seeing is the issue is that on Airbnb's website, there's this thing that says, put in your zip code and they'll tell you how much you can expect to make in a month on Airbnb. And if you look at across Kingston, Beacon, Newburgh, the amount that you can make on Airbnb versus a traditional rental, which is a home for a family, is double or triple what you'd get in rent. So the market has created this environment where that's the most reliable way you can make money in some of these areas. And I mean, so I would be asking, like, how can we incentivize people to fix up these old buildings and turn them into homes for people to live in the community, rather than how can we fix this up so that this can be like a wealth generating asset for somebody without housing a family. But that's my personal opinion.
Alex, could I respond to that just a little bit? I had the opportunity a few years ago of buying a building in uptown Kingston, and it had I borrowed a little bit of money from my father, so it was just a small deposit, and I was able to do a private deal. It had a large upstairs apartment that was basically unrentable. So it was falling apart. The only way that I could make the numbers work was to, I'm an extremely small-scale landlord. None of us here as hosts, I think, want outside investors coming up and buying swathes of property to Airbnb. And I think the evidence at the moment is that that's pretty anecdotal for Airbnb purposes. I'm talking about. It's hard graft doing an Airbnb. Yes, if you look just simply at the numbers of, what can you make Airbnb-ing, you're not taking into account the extraordinary extra costs on time and money of actually presenting a beautiful Airbnb unit. But anyway, getting back to this apartment in the building, the only way we could make the numbers work was to actually turn it into not what you'd consider an Airbnb, although it was on the platform, but more like the extended stay idea. There are many people coming to this area, creatives, filmmakers, technicians, people in digital marketing, who actually need housing too. And they're contributing enormously to the economy and vibrancy of this area. They need a kitchen. They need to be able to stay for a while and feel like it's home. Most hotels don't fulfill that gap, although the hotel industry is, I believe, actually, following Airbnb in a lot of ways. Calling their managers hosts now in some cases. It's sort of interesting, but we have creatives flooding into the area who need extended stay housing. I've had filmmakers for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. They help me pay my mortgage. They help me maintain the building, and then I've done rentals to people who didn't know how long they were going to stay. They ended up staying a year and a half. So it's not as simple as like, there's Airbnb where people, transients is a great word everybody seems to use. I think it's sort of, I don't like the connotations of that word. People, friends are coming to the area, and so it's not always that they're staying just a weekend or 3 days or 7 days over holidays. There's a lot of need at the moment for flexible housing, and I think that's a very valid section of the market. Thank you.
I'll just say really quick. First of all, I don't begrudge anyone for making the personal choices that are incentivized by the market to, obviously logically, like you can make way more money more reliably on Airbnb than you can renting to tenants who, stuff happens with tenants. So I don't begrudge you for saying that. But I also think that if you're a policymaker or if you're thinking, big picture about our community and how it's changing, it's, and I say this as a creative who has done economic development work, and bought into the whole, we need to attract creatives and stuff up here. It's really hard to maintain that when you also are seeing people getting evicted. I just saw someone on Foxhall in Kingston who was paying $1,200 a month in cash with no lease because she couldn't pass a credit check, and she was getting evicted from an absolutely squalid apartment, and she was paying $1,200 a month in cash to live in Midtown Kingston. So terrible. I believe, even though the personal choices that are being incentivized by the market, I don't expect anyone's personal choice to change that. But I also think that we need to change the structure in which these decisions are made, because it's just it's impossible to reconcile the need for creatives coming to Kingston also with the need for people to have a safe place to live. So that's it.
Hi, my name is Amy Rosen. I am an independent contractor, realtor by day. I also do Airbnb to help support myself. And I have a few comments and then a few questions. So first, Alex, what you just said about that woman on Foxhall, that is terrible. And I feel for her deeply. But as somebody who rented my whole life and struggled to, get leases when I wasn't working and had family help me sometimes, I have to say, while her story stinks, I don't think, now that I'm older and whatever, I can see where a landlord wouldn't want to assume the risk of somebody who can't pass a credit check. So there must be other ways. I don't know. With all due respect, I feel it's complex. It can't just, I don't think the landlord's to blame there. And I feel for her at the same time. So, is there a grassroots organization around town that can help her in some way? I'm just curious.
There's lots of charity, but what we're looking to do with the tenants union is that we're not calling it a housing crisis anymore. We're calling it a tenants' rights crisis. No one should have to go to that length to she'd be homeless if she didn't live there. She had to do it. So I can't wag my finger at her and say well, you should have had better credit and been born to a wealthier family and not had the trauma that happened to you to get to this point in your life. I can't do that.
Sure.
So
totally understandable.
She needs rights. She has human rights to have a home.
Absolutely, but also there's this risk thing when you're renting out your place, and that's, I think, a pretty big reason why a lot of landlords have gone with the short-term model. So just thank you, though. Thank you. I really am very sympathetic for her plight, but it's so complex when you put yourself in both sides of the equation. Now, Patty, I fit the profile of that demographic you mentioned of single women over 50 who have to suddenly start thinking about retirement. That is why I started doing Airbnb exactly, to help make ends meet during a career change that, was scary at first, is going pretty well though, and discovered that I really love it. And that, my God, I wish I could do it full time, open an inn even. I really love it, but that's a ways off. But since you brought it up, I got to thinking during this exchange today about one of the most important days of my life, which was the day I finally stopped renting after years of struggling, to find apartments. And rent control dissolving in Santa Monica when I lived there, and moving to New York, and the struggle to find a cheap place in Brooklyn. Yeah, that was fun. But I did ultimately buy a place. I set a goal to do it before I turned 40. It was the most important, or one of the most important days of my life. And the thing is, now that I'm in real estate, I've had a few good listings in the last year or two priced under 200 grand. And I worked so hard to market them to locals because people talk a lot in this area about the housing shortage, for affordable housing, that is. So I was so dismayed with extra marketing effort, open houses, and getting lenders to come to the open houses that would help first-time buyers. Well, nobody came to see either of those houses, and second homeowners ended up buying them, and which is their right. And I came here starting out as a second homeowner. Before that, I rented, and actually got the boot from one of those rentals because the owner decided to make it a short-term rental. So, I mean, I've seen a lot, been through a lot, but this issue of that there are houses around, and if, I mean, it was hard as hell to scrape together that down payment when I bought my first place. But I did it, and on my own, and I'll always be proud of it.
We're running out of time, so
sure,
can we get to a question?
Absolutely. What can we do? I know somebody from RUPCO is standing right behind me, but thank you. Just to wrap it up, what can we do to, look, the monthly payment on a house, once you've dealt with the down payment at that price level, including insurance and including your taxes, is not going to be more than if you were renting. And then these problems of eviction and, bad credit reports suddenly go away, and you take complete charge of your life and have independence. So what can we do to make that happen for more people in this region? I ask you.
I mean, that's a really great question. I think the more partners that we can get together and the more stakeholders we can get together in a community to figure out the answers to that question and figure out how it can work for everyone is definitely going to be the solution for that. I don't have an answer off the top of my head, to be quite honest. But, I do think that, as a renter myself, it is difficult to own, and I hope one day I can. But, I think that you have to really assess, all the variables within a community and come to that solution so that it helps everyone in this situation. It can't just be one side versus the other. It has to, be a level playing field for everyone.
For sure. I wonder if there's anybody in the room that has, further insights.
I just want to say your big question. There is no one answer to that question, but I do want to address what I keep sort of hearing. I just want to, if people's rents are lower, then they're not going to live paycheck to paycheck as much, which means they're going to put money in the bank, which means they'll have money in the bank to become a homeowner. So reducing rent cost is going to have a ripple effect on increasing people's ability to be a homeowner. That said, we learned some very hard lessons about home ownership this last recession, and it's really spinned people's ideas about how much we want to be pushing home ownership. So that's a whole nother conversation as well. Now, clearly, I don't know if we learned all the lessons that we needed to learn, but we are not just throwing mortgages at people the way that we are, which exacerbated the situation and why we had a housing bust. But I think it's really important that these, again, so many dominoes and so many things that are interconnected, and we have so many renters, 8 out of 10, that have no ability to put money away. And if their housing costs weren't taking so much of their money, they could build up that money to put a down payment on a house if they so chose to go down that path. we have a bunch of more people, so I think we'll take everybody that's online now, but please make it short and concise because we're down to the wire here.
Hi, my name's Kathy Maloney, and like the lady in front of me, I fit the demographic of over 50 and single, and I also remember the most proud day of my life of buying my own home. I also realize and remember not so fondly the day I had to sell that home because I couldn't afford to live in it anymore. And I just want to say that I'm not sure that you should be proud of the statistic that your biggest growth is in for women over 50, because we're being forced into that situation. That's not a choice that we're making. We're being forced into it because for years and years and years, more so than the women that are younger than us, we have been underpaid. We have not been able to get the jobs that we need. Personally, I worked at a job for 3 years and I never made what my male predecessor made. And I had more experience. So this is not your problem. This is a bigger problem. This is a societal problem. But I please ask you not to be proud of that number.
Go ahead.
I'm almost 50. My home is my only asset from a divorce. I am a committed resident of the town of Gardner, which I love. And I poured my whole heart and my entire life into that town every day. And I'm going through an interesting experience, Alex, that I think I might be evicted as a homeowner from my own town. See, if my town chooses to take away the only way that I can afford to live in my house while I serve my community every day, I will, in essence, be evicted from my home. I will, like the woman in front of me, I will have to sell my house. I will have to give up the only thing that I love. And like her and the woman before her, it was a big deal for me when I got to that spot in my life where I was able to buy a home. It felt so good. Yeah, no, do I want to rent it every single, weekend? No, and I don't, But it does allow me to pay my $13,000 in taxes every year. And my mortgage. I'm not buying clothes, I'm not buying shoes, I'm not doing anything else with that money, but just surviving in my house. So when we talk about eviction, when we talk about a housing crisis, it is on both sides. So what are we talking about, right? Like, where is the balance? How do we balance this out? How can small towns like Gardner become more educated, open their eyes and understand that this is real? This is a real thing. Housing crisis is also for homeowners. Homeowners also have rights. It is human rights. Today, we are all talking about human rights. I'm a human. I have rights. And I hope I don't get evicted. Thank you.
Hi, I'll make this really short, but one of the things I mentioned in my, I'm not at all against affordable housing. I'm full support of it for those that are in need of it, especially I'm disabled, the elderly, people who are living on the edge. I'm talking about creating opportunities to avoid that, not to not focus on how important affordable housing is. I'm going to be posting, I hope a lot of people might be from New Paltz, or if people can share this on, I'm going to be putting an article that I just found deliberately. 30 years ago, I watched the exodus of Ford from Mahwah and how it made, that was the start of my social consciousness on how removing industry from our communities, big industry, that took care of its employees and allowed them to own homes and grow and so on and so on. When they left, things started to change. I said, oh, this does not bode well for the future. Then IBM crashed. And then business after business after business are moving out of New York. California, this article is actually about California, and comparing it to the mass exodus of people who can afford homes out of New Jersey, New York, and California because of the exodus of big business, because of hyper-taxation. This is what's creating a lack of jobs. So there's two problems we need to focus on. One is creating affordable housing for those that have it and creating jobs for those that want them, to recreate so people can be empowered. Women, men, people over 50, people under 50, people 25 years old should be able to buy a house again. That should be an attainable dream. Anyway, I'm going to post that article as a public share. so that to give a different perspective of why we have this housing crunch and how we could avoid it. Thank you very much for your patience with my different idea.
Thanks, Val. I think any serious policymaker or decision maker knows that jobs are part of the equation. And we're at a time right now where everybody's working. We have these very low unemployment rates that some folks like to brag about. But guess what? We're working harder and more hours, and wages have been stagnant for decades. So the jobs that we have are not aligned with the costs that people are confronted with. That is definitely an important part of the equation. Did you have a question? Did somebody else? Were you just hanging out? Okay, great. I guess that's it. I'm going to ask. Oh, one more. Okay.
As the assistant assessor for the city of Newburgh, the thing I see all the time, people come into my office, taxes, taxes, taxes. They can't afford their houses anymore. Taxes are too high. That's the issue.
Housing, jobs, and taxes were the three top drivers that people spoke of. So people who live here know that because they live it. I'm going to ask Guy and Jerry to come up and close us out now.
Well, I've been doing this for 51 years and I cannot summarize the event. Please fill out your evaluation form, as it's very important for us to know what we did well and what we did less well so that we can do better every time. Please pay attention to the back of your program, as we have events all the time. Some have some fee connected, some are free, and we'd like to see you up on your campus as much as you can be here, as it enriches our lives and it enriches our students' lives and it enriches the community if you engage. Two or three things. One, we know that state law has to apply to upstate New York, not just downstate New York, and we know that's extraordinarily challenging from the questions we heard, so that we have to educate our policymakers to assure that when we write laws, they can be implemented with consideration of our circumstance in the smaller municipalities across the state, those that are densely populated, those that are less densely populated. Second, we know that when we change one thing, a lot of other things change, or a lot of things are implicated. So if we change regulations or we create regulations or potential regulations on rents, there are consequences for our planning, there are consequences for other community, our regulation. And we heard how important the engagement of government and its capacity to do its job well in a changing environment is to proper and effectively achieving the goals and ends of policy. We also heard that the housing, this is not rocket science, not great social science, but we heard the housing issue has extraordinary range of dimensions, and the focus of the conference, today's meeting, could not contain the range of topics that arose. So we heard about the need for economic development and jobs that are sensitive to community needs, and heard about social policy that has to inform housing policy and vice versa. So it's a euphemism or not very wise to say that everything's connected, but you need to enter somewhere. You can't enter everywhere. You need to enter in an accessible place to what the mayor and I were talking about as a destructive cycle, and create a creative cycle and a positive cycle. And this seems to me to be a rich potential area to enter, to have multiple consequences. We also heard that, I was admiring of Airbnb at its creation, extraordinarily admiring, because somebody identified a slack resource and made it work for people. An empty room is a slack resource. They own that room, and they said, okay, we're going to help you make this work for you. They weren't the first people to do it, but they were the people who did it systematically and across the world, really. And that was so smart. And then it turned into the creation of resources to exploit the network that was created. It was a change in the function of this smart idea. And that has all kinds of consequences for communities. So people investing to benefit from Airbnb is different than people who are taking their slack resources. Several people testified on the panel, and from the audience about taking their resources and making it available to themselves so that they can live and they remain in the community and the community can benefit from their presence. So bad things sometimes happen or not bad things necessarily, but change things happen as a consequence of change itself. And we have to therefore be always attentive and adjusting to the circumstance, the changed circumstance and the changed environment that we create with incremental adjustment. So we're never finished. We're never finished with paying attention to social change, economic change, and engaging in it, including its, and being smart about responding. Another thing that, I guess this is a normative position based upon a boy from Brooklyn's working class origins. My mother and her sisters were great investors in real estate after they gathered enough money. And they bought apartment houses that were rent controlled and they made them available at modest rents to other people in the community. They weren't big business women. They weren't business women at all. They were looking to have a way of making a living. So landlords are making a living. They're not all exploitative people. They're not, we have the word landlord is normative in this room. It's normative and negative. There's the landlords who are the bad people by implication and the tenants who are the good people. And I don't think that's a good way to approach this. The idea of a collaborative approach with all stakeholders being considered and understanding that some people who are renting are making a living. It's their job. It's their good middle-class job so they can live a middle-class life. It's not an exploitative industry that necessarily is destructive. It can be constructive and contributing to the community. So we need to have what many people call for, which is inclusion to address our problems and challenges. I'm so pleased and proud that my colleagues did all the work to put this together. I want to acknowledge Janice and Casa especially for her extraordinary and her directive effort in my office so that the person in charge doesn't go wrong. It's very appreciated. Allegedly in charge. And I want to acknowledge KT, whose research you only begin to hear about and I think will be the focus of extraordinary attention in the Hudson Valley in the next year, and the funders of that research who made it possible for us to do it. So, and also for all of you who came out today and participated. I appreciate that very much. So thank you very much for your presence and the implied confidence in us and the work we do. I value that very much. Thank you.
So I don't have terribly much to add to that. I've observed that these conversations are complicated to have. I've noticed in my professional life that when I want to talk about housing and affordability, people want to talk about taxation and home ownership. And when I start to talk about taxation and home ownership, they want to talk about job creation. And when I talk about job creation and economic development, then they want to talk about the environment. And when I talk about the environment, then they want to talk about transportation. And when I talk about transportation, they want to talk about education. And that's when I think we need to turn to the Benjamin Center to sort this out for us. And so I'm so happy to be here today, and I'm so happy that all of you joined us. And I think that what we've learned today is that change is always coming, whether it's short-term rentals, which is a newly emerging, just in the last 15 years kind of phenomenon, or that hospitality is changing along with everything else in our society. We need to have these conversations, and they're tough, they're difficult, and there'll be differing perspectives about how best we create the world we want to live in. And that's why we come here to this institution to do that. So thank you all so much. I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you, Jerry.